Okay, hello everyone. Thank you. Uh, we have come full circle. We are at the conclusion of the dawn of everything. It's taken since August, I think, July. I don't even remember. A very long time. There's no way to summarize this book like so many of David's writings. There, every paragraph contains so many insights that you can go off on a tangent, and his work is really kind of restraining himself from going off in every direction simultaneously. So the book is meant to be as Simona has put it, a gift to those of us who are intrigued by these questions, but I mean, in my case, I lack the synthetic grasp that he does, and the creative mind to think in so many different ways. So we now know that we've been stuck for so long because we cling to a myth that we as humans haven't lived deliberate, intentional political lives since the dawn of humanity, if not for at least the last 500 years. And we find that Western civilization as a construct and the social sciences themselves are both built upon mutually reinforcing premises. The first, a peculiar formulation of property as a relation between a person and an object characterized by absolute power, which, if you think of that definition, it essentially rests on this idea that human existence is domination. So it's power knowledge, it's Foucault's reasoning, it's Hobbes's reasoning, it's Rousseau's reasoning. Other than Rousseau suggested that there was a time before agriculture when we lived as noble savages. And that we really can't go back. The social sciences has developed in reaction to the kind of premise that Rousseau suggested, that we were pure before this fall. And so social science, whose origins trace to the Enlightenment, so-called Enlightenment, has developed to answer what is not free about us. So the social sciences has been an ongoing trajectory of how we are not free, which of course would make sense that these sorts of gestures have been played out across epochs, and that Foucault is really the most recent sort of logical extreme of that position. So this leaves us with the question, if social sciences have formed, are the product of a reaction against this idea of our pure humanity, of the fear of our pure humanity being unleashed upon the earth, then what good is science? And what good is history? And they do offer an answer, and that is that the best science can do is comparative kind of work. And so they offer a couple questions that are of the kinds of questions that the authors argue makes for good science. Question one, is there a positive correlation between gender freedom and degree of innovation. Question 2, has there been a relationship between external warfare and internal loss of freedoms that then has led to rankings of greater hierarchy? So those are really the 2 questions that according to the authors are 2 examples of the sorts of questions of what constitutes good science, that it is inherently comparative kind of work. So this is an epistemology that really challenges the scientific, the conventional understandings of the scientific method, because it basically has comparison as rather than repetition. And then the other question that they leave us with is, how can we come unstuck from a notion where care requires violence or is built upon violence, and we can replace that with care being mutually defined in relation to freedom. And the book concludes with them saying that we really can't even come to answer that question about how to come unstuck until we recognize the full extent of the myths that are limiting the imagination of our questions. And so I'm going to sort of ask this this question about gender freedom and degree of innovation, and wonder at what kind of time span does I'm just trying to think through that sort of question of how does this fundamentally change the way history gets narrated? Because as much as history has been told through the lens of technology, there is not a robust literature on the extent of gender freedom. And so I'm wondering, how do we go about writing that kind of history, and what does that suggest about the ways that we understand epochs of history? But if we no longer think in terms of epochs of history, then what is it that we're using as the way to think through that? So this book, more than any other book, has, as I have read it, I've had to basically rethink everything I've thought up to that point, and then I read a new chapter, and then I have to rethink everything, because it is an alternate kind of epistemology that is meant to surface questions as you do the reading of it. And I think that's why some academics they've nitpicked the book, I guess is maybe one way, or they've critiqued it as a book that it is not. And I think it's because it hasn't really been approached in the kind of playful way that the authors have intended it. Any one chapter, I think, could challenge anyone received wisdom that kind of is Western liberal thinking. And I think it's such a enormous book that it requires multiple readings. And I honestly don't know how anyone who has written a review of the book has been able to do so, because I mean, to me, it seems to require multiple readings. So one argument in the conventional sense that the authors provide in this final conclusion is that zones of ritual play lead to social experimentation. And that, to me, is the most prescriptive policy kind of statement that they make. I think they are encouraging people to promote zones of ritual play so that we can have the kinds of social experimentation with social freedoms that we can have if we're able to imagine different worlds from the start. And that those zones of ritual play, if the players who are on the field playing are the ones that define the zone of ritual play and how it's played, then that's that's where we can start. We start at playgrounds. And that, I find, a much more attractive political project, starting at a playground, than elsewhere, which also means, what do you find at playgrounds? Of course, children. What do you typically, at least if I can speak from the playgrounds in my neighborhood, one finds a lot of moms. And so it means that the playground revolution, it has to be led by women. And they don't hide that fact, because one of the most important questions one can ask is there a positive correlation between gender freedom and the degree of innovation? And I would suspect that there is, and that cooking would have been one of the sort of first. So I would have loved, obviously, to have seen how they dealt with the period after the 1200s, of the Common Era, because the penultimate chapter, that chapter alone provides a complete reworking the history of North America that no historian of the US, I think, can now avoid. They will be able to avoid it, but that is a fundamental challenge to the composite, to the static composite that has been the conventional wisdom of the indigenous peoples of the region north of present-day Texas. So thank you for being a part of this. I'd love to hear any thoughts that people have. Where do we go from here conceptually? Because what does it even mean to talk about social science anymore? I knew that economics as a discipline was a farce, classical economics, because of its premises. But when we started this reading group, I remember saying that, I was yet to be convinced about all social science sort of being built on these Hobbesian or Rousseauian premises, that I wasn't yet convinced. And I think I wasn't convinced until I read this conclusion, because I didn't realize how much social science was part of the reaction to a myth rather than the product of a history. And that's only one of the major rethinkings that this book has forced me to do. So I'm especially curious, having now completed this book, where all of you, has anything changed based on your reading of this book? Don't tell me you haven't read it.
I fell off the wagon because I was planning a big trip. So I still have to read the last couple of chapters. I don't know if did they mention the spirit level, the book that came out over, I don't know, 15 years ago, 10 years ago? The spirit level the title is Spirit Level, why egalitarian society.
And they don't mention it.
No.
I would have noticed because it's an important book in my...
Exactly. And I don't know why more people don't know about it. It's fascinating to me. These two authors went and researched, I don't know how many countries and how many statistics, and they just came up with a conclusion. Actually, equality does lead, there's a correlation between equality, not just gender equality, but equality in class, and the number of new patents being created. So there is indeed a correlation between inequality, so large, I don't know if they break it down by gender, and innovation. That's the first thing I wanted to say, and I forgot the second. So my biggest take from this book is I have to rethink everything that I thought about older culture. I spent a lot of time thinking about mythology of nature-based cultures, because that's sort of what I focus on. And I cannot believe just how many of them all had slavery and had the same problems that we have. And so honestly, the more you read about humans, the more you like your pets. It's just, I don't know.
Ellen?
Unmuted here. To try to respond to at least one of your questions, one of the things that this book really underlines for me, I don't know how much I can apply it myself as a settler Canadian, but one of the things that's really very much on the agenda in Canada right now, perhaps because we have a somewhat larger proportion of Indigenous people, especially in the part of Canada I live in, than some other places, is that the call to decolonize has become very strong. And there's certainly an enormous amount of pushback, but it's one of the most important things we can be doing. And in terms of some contact I've been able to have, I have, some fictive kin, and I'm in a community that has a lot of Indigenous people. It's an overwhelming reality that there is a culture there that's alive and well and is doing things very differently, and is doing things in a way that we have an enormous amount to learn from. There's to pick up on one point, I mean, they actually do also do things. There's a very important ritual life, and you can think about play, and this is alive and well. People are coming together in powwows, in music, in a shared spirituality that's, you know, diverse, but also people are talking to each other and forming a different world that's really powerful. But it's also very much tied with very practical political movements that are using all kinds of different tools that they have to make the world different. Some of that is processes of care, which is so much needed because of our history of Indian residential schools and murdered and missing Indigenous women and other just terrible things that have been happening. An incredible and growing capacity that's really just leaves a person in awe about the ability of people to come out of this kind of terrible situation and be able to take action on it. And it's culturally expressed in a variety of ways with a really fully rounded and deeply felt way of being that's quite different. And to some extent, people are listening. There's all kinds of pushback, perhaps needless to say, but it's really quite inspirational. So I think that the fact that this is alive and well, even in a place where you might not expect to be finding it, I think is something that's incredibly encouraging. It's then not so easy to know what a settler does about it, except encourage it. You know, in my university, for example, they then tried to get everybody to volunteer to get themselves retrained so we could teach Indigenous things. And I sort of thought, well, isn't that a great solution to hiring people who are Indigenous, right? So it was a bit of so that's sort of there are all kinds of questions about how one moves forward in this. Certainly, if I think about what I might do, I do think that throughout my career, I've thought that what I'm trying to do is to educate people about another society of which I'm a student. And I can't speak for anybody else, but I can try to build bridges. And maybe right now, we particularly need them to be built, given all the warmongering that's going on. So we're each of us positioned differently. So I would just sort of say, I think that there's something really to be said about meaningful play and the space that it creates, and also the fact that it can really be linked with things that are politically incredibly important. There are things that are actually happening that are making the world. Indigenous people in Canada are really remaking things in quite important ways. And they're having successes, but it's taken so many generations, and they still speak about 7 generations. So they've got such a challenging time frame within which they look that they recognize the hard work that's involved. They're really getting places. So it's so all of that is really interesting. I'll just close with one little small point. From the work of Richard Lee on an entirely different topic, is one about innovation. One of the things he proposed a long time ago is the idea that, if we're wanting to look at the origin of tools, why don't we think about a string bag or a fabric bag? This is what women would have been using to carry infants or to carry gathered products, and that here we may find the original innovations. Forget about stone tools. Of course, they last through millions of years, but the original kind of innovations might be something as practical as how you do all your work while you're carrying a baby at the same time, or you're holding onto the baby and you're having to carry the food you gathered or whatever. But a string bag or something of that sort that he was finding working with foraging peoples might be the kind of thing that was initially invented. And you can't build any theory on that, but it's an interesting observation. Sorry,
I just want to say thank you. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say I'd finished, but I said it after the mute. So now I'm muting again.
Well, I want to say thank you to Steve for Steven for carrying it all. That was like such an enormous work, and I probably would not be able to read it from one page to another, because like to be told all the chapters like while they will be reading, but written. But yeah, it was like really first experience for me in my life to be part of this community for such a long time, very regularly. So that was like really amazing. Thank you everybody, and thank you, Steven. Yeah, and I just wanted to have to like not answer this ground question, but to have some small question to ask about war. So that's about how the war is almost unavoidably leading to the loss of internal freedom. And that's probably what we can see now in the countries that involved in the current wars. But I remember how David was telling me how it's like after in a way success of social movements in the US, then suddenly Iraq war started, and then the September 11 things also end up in this patriotic acts where the government was allowed to spy on everybody, and you know, a lot of freedoms were taken away. So I think it's some kind of like, now we can see this correlation, but is it some more description of this mechanism? How does it happen? And if it's possible to undo that, and how we should undo that, you know, with what kind of tools can we develop? And yeah, talking about Harun Farooqui and a bunch of movies, and people in the group also can see them about war. And so he was reflecting on the visual skills of how we saw the war in Iraq and Vietnam, so the war that unfolded during his time. And now this voice has a very different visuality and different ways how it's presented. So yeah, but it's still follow on the same logic that kind of described in this book. You know, how like dominance is leading to certain social constructions, and how war and loss of freedoms are related. And in a way, it's like a play that you're stuck in. So if the war could be playful, like a chess could be also described as a war with the equal partner, but then here we have some other type of the play that is sealed with the violence, and then after the sealing, you can't go, you cannot change the rules, something like that.
Hey, Simona.
Yeah, actually, as I told, sometimes I cheated with this book, and I started from this conclusion that makes the book so much clearer than, because it's a very difficult book. There's plenty of information, and at times they seem to be playing. They were actually playing, but also there is a sense of the book, and these conclusions make sense of all the journey they took us along. And actually, we wondered what would David say about war, and it's in this chapter, page 505. My English is lowering, sorry for it. And they take from archaeological evidence that war is not natural, is not embedded in human societies, and there were centuries of peace, just as slavery has been abolished many times in human history, so has war. And war is not just violence, it's a very specific kind of violence. It entails schismogenesis, and it entails the construction of enemy images, as my friend Rosemary said. It's a specific kind of contest between two clearly demarcated sides, and it's organized violence. And at the same page, the authors say play kings cease to be play kings precisely when they start killing people. So what's specific of war is play ends when killing starts. And I'm putting these ideas very much in connection with what Elias Canetti said about crowds and power, and how crowds stop. Canetti says an open crowd, the experience of being part of a crowd is liberating, in as much it ends the fear of being touched. It overthrows borders, and it opens the doors, and it smashes the walls that separate us from our houses, from the external world, us from the others. And a crowd starts to be another thing when it becomes closed, and when it puts on borders. And the very essence of borders, of the creation of enemy images, is the forbidding metamorphosis, which is, in David's terms, the ability to reinvent ourselves. So what I'm thinking about these days is how is the connection between borders, freedom as property that is about as exclusion, as creating borders inside which you are supposedly free to do whatever you want, even to kill slaves. And the states as constructions of borders and as unity and forbidding metamorphosis and forbidding the multiple identities inside one state. All of this and war. War is about being stuck in a schismogenesis, in one identity. Is about being obliged to be just Russian, just Italian, just a woman also. It's about forbidding the multiple identities, the crowd that is inside us, the multiplicity that constitutes our subjectivity, and that is ever moving, ever reinventing, ever playing. So there is a direct connection with between the end of play, the end of experimenting of possibilities, of metamorphosis, and schismogenesis, and war, and border, and creating borders. And this is my fundamental take from this chapter. And also about social science, what the authors say actually is social sciences are born as a reaction to the idea of let us call them recipes for revolution, of enlightenment as the only way to plan for a change in society. And actually, it's against the idea that the only way to change society is to have a plan, to have a recipe, instead of our collective ability that lies in imagination, in tradition, in social relationships, to build something different. So I'll be quiet now.
Yeah, they're saying that this is actually social science was born out of conservative, not actually,
Yeah, but sorry, Mark. Yes, it is born from out of conservative thought, but because conservative thought was about proving that French Revolution was a product of Enlightenment, and Enlightenment was depicted as a top-down project, a rational project, as something that was against a collective project, while the whole idea of even of pirates and of Enlightenment was about collective, the public opinion, public discourse, and this has been totally erased from history. Our idea of Enlightenment is some knowledgeable people having a project that has to be legally enforced on society.
Mark?
Oh, yes, Steve. I also wanted to second what Nika had said, and thanking you for leading us through all these months, because it kept us on our toes. But I also appreciated everybody's ideas. I'm a very slow thinker, so oftentimes it's later on that I'm still thinking about what someone has said and contributed. I will not stop rereading this book for I don't know how long. These last two chapters, it was like a sort of the spiral going up from chapter 2 of Kandiaronk. And then we have all the evidence they're presenting to us. And then we come to these last few comparisons. And Simona was talking about the war, but what kept me up last night was actually this comparison of torture as viewed by the Wendots and as viewed by Europeans, the Jesuits. And I just, I'm still thinking about it. I'm still trying to figure out things. And that's what I love about the authors, is they're not going to give you the answer. What they're doing is they're putting these particular comparisons together, and over again. This is so typical of everything in the book. It's like leaving another thought experiment for us to work out. And so and this, as Ellen was saying about, rewriting our history here in the North America, this is huge. And I think some of you might have seen, I was at an elders meeting on Zoom. These were the Ojibwe from Lake Superior, and the big yellow book had come up. They didn't say the authors, but they said the big yellow book. People are finally getting things right. I mean, they're finally figuring things out. So these are the elders, from that band of the Chippewa, had brought up the David's book. And so that sort of rewriting of our history is going to be, this is invaluable. This, I mean, again, just presenting how, and the time frame. So hundreds of years, how long has Europe been without a war? The Wendots had hundreds of years without wars. And so maybe that torture that they're talking about was a ritual torture. And so one of the things that was occurring to me was, maybe you have to have some violence to contain violence. So you separate out the violence from the two. I don't know. Again, they don't give us answers. And I'm, so grateful for that, in terms of motivating us, giving us tools for our imagination. So it's just, an incredible book.
Nika, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I also it was fascinating to read about torture, but I think they're saying that it's also some kind of glitch, because there was a period when this sadistic, theatrical things wouldn't happen as well. Yeah, so I think in general, at least my feeling was always that David was believe that we actually can figure out how to live without war and without torture, and it's very much possible. Just kind of require certain, Simona said, collective framework and desire to push it. That's very necessary right now.
Yeah, for me, the book ultimately is really liberating, because it reminds me that ethnography is play, and that if you approach the work that way, excuse my dog, if you approach the work that way, then you can actually lay out what evidence you're using, how you're using it, and you're being transparent about the epistemologies that you're creating, and sort of like, so it just reinforces an idea that's been with this group from the start, even in other formulations when it's read other works by Graeber, and that is his ultimate position, that ideas are inherently collective, and that any argument he's making is really a dialogue that he happens to be making in that moment in time, resting on the shoulders of giants before him, and that's it's a reminder that yes, this work can be very serious and that lives are at stake, but that scholarship, at least, is ultimately a form of play, and that political ideas ought to be approached in a playful, dialogic way, which is a fascinating approach for someone who simultaneously believes that culture is ultimately creative refusal. So it challenges someone to state up front what are they unwilling to do, and those are the everything else is basically play. It's again, I mean, with Graeber's work, it's always just it's this really creative inversion of what we're generally not taught, but that makes sense when you think through the full extent of the logic. Anyone else? Let's see. Oh, yeah. Wow. We're Mary. Did you want to? I didn't know if that was a.
Yeah. I just want to say so many things. The first thing, I just to point people in this direction. The Davids frame it as play. That's a bit of a Western mindset type of framing. When you study, I think, when you study indigenous cultures, what we call play, it's part of their spiritual and rituals, their spiritual practice. So if you're interested in this, when you study their spirituality, their mythology, their rituals, that's what Davids called play. I gave the example of how corn got essentially invented. Corn was just a tiny bit of grass with nothing like 5 kernels, and it ended up becoming this plant. And it was precisely through what we see it as play, to them was part of worshiping in different ways. It's sort of merged. I don't know how to explain it. It's playful form of worshiping, kind of. So it ties in what Ellen was saying about meaningful play. To them, it had this underlying concept of spirituality. And I'm trying to find this podcast episode, because this guy talks about what happens when cultures don't have a way of a ritual for violence, because this ritualized violence gave people an opportunity to sort of purge all these emotions, especially men. And without that, you end up with actual war. And there's a lot of studies around that, and it's a really big subject. Yeah, I'm gonna try see if I can find that episode podcast, and I'll share it with you guys. So yeah, I think I'm just very interested in not just decolonization, but the future of the conversation. I think it's going to be us finding out how Indigenous people did things better and learning things from them. And yeah, and I'm pretty sure that's we're going to discover a lot of what the Davids talk about play, and about how equality leads to innovation and all these things.
Hey, Michael.
Yeah, so just, I mean, I really took to what Ellen said on the like the grass bag as a sort of a type of innovation, and that exactly how we define technology. It's always like, if there's no kind of clear definition, but you kind of think, oh, technology must be like mobile phones and missiles and electronics, and it's this cutting edge technologies, and those are what governments fund as technologies, and the technologies are funded as a way to compete in the economy with other. If we have the technology, we can be more successful. But what something, one thing was example of a pacifier that as a piece of material culture that is a technique in child rearing, whether you think it's good or bad, it's like done a huge amount for women in terms of child rearing and people don't think of something like that as a technique, as a technology. So I think, I guess my kind of take on the book is this interesting that this claim that gender relations and war in particular are used to build power dynamics, and in that they care gets conflated with a type of violence or a type of control, and that builds into people an inability to imagine the world in a particular way or alternatives. And that this book, it doesn't really claim that there has, it just says something's gone wrong and we now live in a world where there's all of these hierarchies. In many ways, that's quite clear. You can see a continuum of the Roman Empire to now, since, they study the classics in Oxford and learn Latin to in order so they can then get a job in the banking industry. It's quite that you can see that continuum of a kind of violent culture carrying on, and that people are learn not to know and learn not that somehow that these kind of thing that another world isn't possible, another type of politics, another type of economics, another type of university, another type of social science, and so I guess that's the thing that I think is great about this book. Obviously, the discovery of Kandarok is marvelous, but I don't know if really David Graeber discovered Kandarok. He just sort of made it public. He was lucky enough to be successful as a big intellectual and then go and find what other scholars had done, a lot of Native American scholars. So that story of Mark saying, yes, they were talking about the big yellow book and saying that people have are now starting to understand what's been going on. So in some sense, the book isn't, it is amazing for being the amount of circulation it's got, and it's amazing for undoing really a myth that it got on the New York Times bestseller list, and now everybody's discussing it and everybody's saying, wow. And it's very well timed, because people are like, oh, it's a trap. What are we going to do? We've got climate change and war, and technology is going to, there's no way out. It's just going to be a big disaster. And then there's this kind of claim, well, actually, we don't really know what the way out is, but we definitely know that lots of people have been creative. And here is a way to talk about that. Some of the, questions that social science could be asking around gender relations. There's a huge literature on gender relations, and it is already widely acknowledged, even in major institutions like the United Nations or the World Economic Development Forum. They always talk about, the rights of women in in developing countries, and how that would, that would improve the economy, all of those things. So these issues are already there, already acknowledged, even if they're suppressed at the same time. And this book is a great opportunity for people to kind of yes, we knew a lot of this stuff, didn't we? But it's really not just attacked the scholarship, because if you look closely, a bunch of people would agree probably with the scholarship. A little bit harder to say that it's not inevitable that we have this kind of problem. They've made the argument that it's not inevitable. I think a lot of people will still feel that it might be inevitable, because they do say, well, how did we get stuck in this way? They do raise that issue. And it's, in many ways, the book is, when you read between the lines, it's a bit depressing about how difficult things have been in many ways, but they've told the story not in a miserable way that all these bad things happened. They've told the story that all these bad things happened with the possibility of that not being the case, and that it's still the possibility of that not being the case. So rethinking, social relations on these ways, and trying to think what would our social science or our ideas be? And I guess I'm quite sympathetic to social science in the sense that they're meant largely social science, and all the academics in general are quite liberal. Like the Republican Party tried to shut down political science in America because they said political science shouldn't be funded because the political scientists weren't saying things that they agreed with. So there are definitely lots of lefties in many ways. It still becomes a bit of a problem because the government funds universities. Universities are ultimately state institutions. The government funds new technology. Then the kind of funding for development of technology is often centralized in universities and focused on things that particular people need. So looking at that relationship of how we forget and how our relations are become a way that we can't imagine something else, I think is one of the key parts of this book. And so looking at, and tying that to innovation at the end, I didn't really see until Ellen said that, until Steve brought it up as a specific point. I had it with one of my little tags in my book, that point that Steve said, that here's one of the key lessons. What is women's relationship to innovation in a society? And Mary's remarks on the spirit level, having actual statistics about that is great. So that I think that's a great point. And it also is, David doesn't talk a lot about technology per se, but maybe that's because technology ultimately is a social relations. It's material culture, a pottery that someone might argue as a diffusionist that this type of pottery was also brought to here and brought to there is also a type of social relation. So all of the material culture as technology, material culture as social relations. I think that's maybe a great way to look forward at those kind of things. I would say creative refusal is a great way to respond to a problem, but that idea of schismogenesis as a great thing, this kind of schismogenesis is also labeled in this final chapter as a bit of a problem because people were trapped in a war, so they identified themselves as someone different than that. So it was creative refusal. So in some sense, in the book, they're not that excited about equality, right, as a term, because equality was sort of like what you did when you lost the freedom and free play in society, where people could all be different, not necessarily equal to each other, but different. But then when violence came in, people tried, and hierarchy was structured, then you had to, as a response, you refused that and tried to do equality, and it became very measured. We're all equal, but how do we create ways to stop that? So it's in some ways that kind of the schismogenesis is a response, and the creative refusal is this great term that you're not trapped in a reaction to violence by using violence. You've negated me, I'll negate you, but you're escaping. So they really don't focus on justice like will defeat the enemy. Their images escape, right? Which makes it a tough thing because we now live in a global society where like satellites watch us all. But the current state of anti-globalization is very strong. Both the right wing and the left wing have populist movements that are resisting globalization, saying we want safety, we want protection, and they want protection from the capitalist liberal, neoliberal extremism where banks can go to every country and use it as a resource. And that has resulted in unemployment and resulted in poverty, wealth differentials, kind of bad, a lot of technologies that are not very useful, like an internet that can surveil you rather than the internet that really focuses on us being able to link from many countries like we are doing right now and be able to communicate. So that kind of resistance is actually a claim for freedom. The fight against the neoliberal globalization is an attempt to escape. It's quite hard to find new places to escape because you can't just go, let's just pick up and go to the wilderness and build a new home, right? There's not as many wildernesses left. But like that image of freedom, maybe we can kind of claim some of the resistance to globalization is an image of freedom.
All right. So again, thank you, everyone. Next week on the 24th, there is a talk on the philosopher Roy Bhaskar, one of David Graeber's favorite philosophers. So I encourage you to tune in. The normal link and the time. I know I will be tuning in. So it's nice seeing you, and I hope that our paths cross again. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Steve. What you did is enormous, and I forgot to thank you for it. But really, thank you very much.
Oh, of course, yeah. And if anyone has other announcements, I didn't mean to like sign us off so abruptly, but I was gonna stop the recording.